assessment is I think he is fully capable of building a prosperous, strong Russia. It's a big challenge. I think he's fully capable of doing it.
But from the start, Clinton's private fears about Putin were being realized.
From the very beginning, you saw in Putin somebody who didn't have the values of the West. Piece by piece, he is dismantling the structures of democracy, fragile though they were, that have been put in place, and reconsolidating control of the Kremlin. That's not a Westernizer. That's not a Democrat's lobby. That's an old-fashioned Russian autocrat that we saw and should have seen from the very beginning. Literally one of the closest elections in American history.
It was the start of a new presidency in the U.S. Voter George W. Bush.
So.
And explaining my attitude about the post-war.
Saw in President Bush someone that he could do business with. He was seeking a new great power relationship that President Bush could be a leader who he could work with to redefine the international system.
His early moves consolidating power and his past as a KGB agent didn't deter the Bush team.
It didn't bother me that Putin was KGB. The KGB wrote the thing for yourself, so actually that struck us as an opportunity. I don't think anybody was looking at this through the
dossier on President Bush was trying to find his weaknesses, appeal to his personality traits.
Putin went for Bush's strong Christian faith.
President Putin told President Bush about the time his dacha burned down and a religious medallion which had belonged to his mother, which had gotten lost, and he thought this was irretrievably gone. The firemen get this.
That's a
It's a very affecting, emotional story, and had some effect on
damn, it's all kind of shit.
To President Bush, is this a man that Americans can trust? I'll answer the question. I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward. I was able to get a sense of his soul. A man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
And Bush keeps that in mind, right? That I looked into his eyes and got a sense of his soul. And we go, uh-oh. And Condi does her version of not comfortable. He just reacts, just for a second.
For the moment, Putin had won over the American president.
He was trained not to reveal his soul, to say so, if he has had. His life experience didn't allow him to reveal any inner he, any true he, to any representative of the West. West, for him, remains to be the enemy. And the United States, as the leader of the West, is the enemy number one. The countdown from it appears is now underway.
Soon, more fuel for Putin's grievance with the U.S.
U.S.-led attack on Iraq.
America shot and regime change at the hands of the Bush administration.
The styles and stripes that come to town. Saddam
Hussein's reign of terror is over. The Iraq War was absolutely a turning point and a very significant moment of rupture in the relationship between Putin and President Bush.
Echoes of the final days of the Soviet Union.
The tyrant has fallen, and Iraq is free. And everywhere that freedom stirs, let the tyrants fear.
An adventure like the Iraq War shows, that look, they'll just come in and they'll just take out a government and think nothing of it. And that's not the way he wanted the world to work.
And it is both our responsibility and our privilege to fight freedom's fight.
Bush called it the Freedom Agenda, a plan to export American democracy around the world. Putin saw it as a direct threat to his own plan to restore Russian greatness.
Vladimir Putin concluded that the United States, when possible, would use its power and leverage to depose leaders that it did not agree with. And from Vladimir Putin's perspective, that was an existential threat.
The Bush doctrine is spreading freedom around the world.
Under Bush, that threat was extending to Putin's own backyard.
This will be my report from here. The tower renovations are nearly complete. And the program reactivated under the supervision of Dr. Mahler. What do you hope to achieve? Results after decades of misguided research. Don't you see? Evolution doesn't happen in the lab. It happens in the wild.
And stall in these neighboring countries. Regimes that would be anti-Russian.
Putin had seen enough. He would fight back.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is speaking at an international conference in Germany.
He'd do it in Munich, Germany, issuing a warning to America and the world.
As he comes to the security conference in Munich, he says basically, I don't have to mince words, do I? I can say what's on my mind. And then he just lashes out and he lists all these resentments.
Перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Кому это понравится? Кому это понравится? Почему лисичьи?
My head's down. It was so searing and blunt, and I felt this was the real guy.
И это, конечно, крайне опасно. И ведет к тому, что никто уже не чувствует себя в безопасности. Я хочу это подчеркнуть. Никто не чувствует себя в безопасности.
Echoed the whole world rhetoric, accusing the US of making the world unsafe.
Premier Vladimir Putin left no doubt he sees responsible for the current global crisis.
Putin, clearly in this speech, was drawing the line and saying, we're not going to try it. We're just giving up. We're going to make our own world in which we are the master.
It's one of Putin's harshest attacks on America in his 7-year term.
After that speech, we saw the first long-range nuclear bombers by Russia. We saw the devastating cyber attack in Estonia in 2007. We were starting to see steps taken that represented a Russian assertiveness that we had not seen. We did not necessarily understand that 2007 is the date where he wanted to stop that democratization.
The leaders of NATO began today's summit.
6 years since the establishment of the NATO-Russia Council.
But Bush ignored Putin's warning,
Taken by this summit will affect the future of the Atlantic.
ratcheting up the conflict, encouraging Georgia and Ukraine, two former Soviet republics, to join NATO.
It must be clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for the membership in NATO.
Russians told us that the Bush administration was moving towards
crashes the dinner with the NATO members. He has basically shown up as the skunk in the garden and challenging them.
It was clear if we wanted to see the direction that President Putin was going.
Putin made it clear he wouldn't accept Bush's plan for Georgia and Ukraine.
It basically waved the red flag in front of the bull. It was extremely provocative for Russia. It provoked Russia. It made Russia angry.
Just 4 months later, Putin attacked Georgia.
Russian troops mounted by tanks and armored vehicles.
Russians were prepared and perhaps even eager for a Georgia.
There appeared to be little troops in there.
And part of that was motivated by we're going to show the Georgians that getting too close to NATO has a price.
Russian planes again bombing Georgia.
Putin's siege then held nearly 5,000 square miles of Georgian territory.
The town is burning, more civilians have been killed.
From Putin's point of view, this wasn't just about Georgia. Fierce battle broke out today on the Crimea. This was about Ukraine. This was about what he saw to be the West's interest in, eventual expansion of NATO, potentially to include Ukraine and Georgia.
Some of those Georgian soldiers were saying, "Where is the United States?"
As the war broke out, Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush happened to be at the Olympics in Beijing.
Bush finds himself at the Olympics sitting in the same row as Putin. He has his wife Laura, the king of Cambodia, move aside so he can sit next to Putin and talk about it. But he knows the cameras are on. So he's trying not to make it a big visible confrontation. But he's telling Putin, "What are you doing here? This is not right. You can't be doing this." And Putin is basically telling him to butt out.
The president had looked into this and now reached a different conclusion about just who Vladimir Putin was.
I'm in medical.
Keep going to the back exit. I'll contact you there.
There's no room. Patients stacked in the hall. The first case came in an hour ago, and they just keep coming. We're losing control. We have to find Mueller. The hell is she?
To his successor.
They let Vladimir Putin arguably get away with it in Georgia. One message that Putin clearly takes from that, in hindsight, is that he is able to use as a tool of achieving his political ends outside the borders of Russia, and that the West will complain and lecture, but basically will be That's a terrible message, and I think it is a prologue for the Ukraine disaster. All Americans can celebrate red or blue, black or white. First African-American president of the United States. President Obama set to land in Russia.
Less than a year later, Vladimir Putin would meet with the elected Barack Obama face to face.
Obama has a big meeting at
Sizing up his third American president.
Shadows of a Cold War will loom over his summit. I remember their first meeting in July of 2009 at Putin's dacha, just outside Moscow. They're much different personalities. President Obama's initial question, about 10 seconds, led to a 45-minute, monologue by Putin.
He is extraordinarily calm, matter of fact.
Found one of those gloves that Captain Ferris had.
That's a grip. Bastard guards love to use it on us inmates. But it's good. It works on all sorts of things, too. Go on, give it a go.
Obviously, the non-respect. He looked at the United States and thinking surprising that a black man would be elected president of the United States. I think that was a surprise to him. And I think there could be an element of flat-out racism that he somehow thought Obama was not his equal. That Obama
They said, all right, Joe Biden, this is your issue.
For 4 decades, and chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Biden, like Putin, has a
For myself, I don't trust the Soviets. I don't trust them. They are sure of what they can get away with.
paradigm through which he saw the similar
Leaders. He saw them as thugs.
Oh shit.
It's been excessively and his attention.
What's in it? What? That's good.
Biden was right about his autobiography.
But argumentative from start to finish.
I understand with that Vice President Biden. The message that he's sending is, let's not, we're not here to kid each other. We need to speak clearly. We need to speak directly.
I'm looking into your eyes, I told him, smiling. I don't think you have a soul. He looked at me for a second and smiled back. We understand each other, he said. And we did.
When Biden said that to me, I hadn't heard it before, and my immediate reaction was, this sounds like a movie. Is that what really happened? And he said, absolutely, positively, that's who this guy is.
And Biden wasn't done. In front of students, he urged the Russian people to stand up to Putin's regime.
The Russian people want to live in a country that fights corruption. So I urge all you students here, don't compromise with the basic elements of democracy. You need not make that Faustian bargain.
For Putin to see American Vice President go talk to students and encourage democracy, he sees it as a threat. Who are you to come here and plant trouble in my backyard? It's aggravating and offensive to Putin to see that kind of action.
And later that year, protesters right outside the Kremlin. It looked like what Biden had been calling.
Tens of thousands came out on the streets to tell Vladimir Putin they had enough.
There's hundreds of thousands of people who were marching the streets of Moscow shouting down with Putin. For him, it was like,
He's made a selection.
so it would happen.
He was thrown by the protests. He was taken aback by the passion of the opposition and had to look for a place to point the finger. He pointed it at us.
Cracked down.
Russian police have arrested about 200
The arrest appears to be part of a broad and deliberate crime.
Questions about justice is Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Начинаются обыски, начинаются аресты, задержания, какие-то действия вмешающие в позиции, начинаются травли в средствах массовой информации, и власть переходит к точечным репрессиям. Я называю их точечными, потому что они затрагивают десятки, сотни, но может быть тысячи человек по стране.
Many of Putin's opponents inside Russia fled the country.
Opponents say, I'm scared that Putin will kill me.
Others died mysterious deaths.
A discovered dead in a DC hotel
One who nearly died twice from poisoning was Vladimir Karamirza.
Bad things often happen.
There's been a very high mortality rate in the last several years among the people who have crossed the path of Vladimir Putin's Kremlin. Independent journalists, anti-corruption campaigners, opposition activists, opposition leaders. Many people have died. Some in strange and unexplained deaths, others in just straight-out assassinations.
Putin exchanged
themselves in the reference to professional military, wearing Russian-style combat uniforms, but doing something Russian.
You should give military assistance to Ukraine. You need to step up what you're doing against Russia. Putin is getting the wrong message from us, and Obama wouldn't do it.
Biden lost. Instead of weapons, Obama went with sanctions.
From Obama's perspective, nobody had elected him to the White House to be focused on Russia and Ukraine. And now you have your vice president bending your ear about the need to draw a bright line and say that Russian aggression cannot stand. I think there was a piece of Obama that looked at this and said, sorry, this is just not a top priority for us.
Putin takes a lesson from Ukraine when he's able to invade a country, and our reaction is minimal. Right? And so, of course, he takes a lesson from that. The lesson he takes from that is this kind of thing can work if we gin it up properly. And that's not the message that we really wanted to be sending at the time.
The 2016 presidential race is underway.
Having tested the United States' resolve, Putin would go even further.
And the candidates are once again fanned out of
striking at the heart of American democracy.
Candidates make a final push to shore
interfering in the 2016 presidential election.
There's two goals there: to discredit our election and also to discredit the presidency, to neutralize the United States as an adversary, to really tarnish US leadership as, the leader of the democratic world, the free world, the West.
Putin's attack was aimed at Washington, D.C. Russian hackers breaching Democratic Party computer servers. Email leaks designed to undermine Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign.
This was the most aggressive and most direct and most assertive campaign that the Russians ever mounted in the history of our elections. And what characterized this were the variety and intensity of the techniques that they employed.
Misinformation, fake users designed to look like Americans, trolls supporting the Kremlin, an army of automated bots on Twitter, and targeted advertisements on Facebook and Google, calculated to hurt Clinton and help her rival, Donald Trump.
President Putin's view of Trump was a penchant for authoritarianism, a backing off of human rights, and talking about wanting to have a more positive relationship with Russia. What's not to like if you're Vladimir Putin? It sort of sounds like he's one of us.
Well, Donald Trump pulled off one of the biggest political upsets in America.
On election night, a victory for Trump and for Putin.
In a stunning upset, Donald Trump is elected the 45th president.
Donald Trump shocking the nation and the world.
President Putin called me up very nicely to congratulate me on the win of the election.
From Putin's point of view, he won. Not only did the candidate he favored come out on top, he has disrupted Americans' faith in their own democracy. So that we're all turning on each other and we're busy fighting with each other. And in his mind, hopefully too distracted to pose a threat to him on the world stage.
President Trump's Helsinki summit with President Vladimir Putin.
For the fourth time, Vladimir Putin would confront a new American president.
Urging the president to confront Putin about Russia's interference in the 2016 election.
Vladimir Putin is as clear-eyed and cold-blooded as any foreign leader I have ever seen. He knows exactly what he thinks Russia's national interest is, and he pursues it unrelentingly.
We get the first images of President Trump and Vladimir Putin sitting down next to each other. And President Trump is sitting up in his chair, looking as though he really, really wants to get something out of this meeting.
Well, first of all, Mr. President, I'd like to congratulate you on a really great World Cup.
And Vladimir Putin is kind of slumped in his chair, not smiling, doesn't look like he's having a good time.
That getting along with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing.
It was clear that in Trump, Putin had a very different American president.
Confronted with Donald Trump, this is like an open field in front of a football player carrying the football.
Thank you.
Trump never understood that, never understood what the nature of Putin's game was. I think Putin thought Trump was a fool and easily manipulable.
The cameras were sent away. For 2 hours, they met privately, without any aids.
Putin didn't need the KGB's psychological profilers to hand him a dossier on how to play Donald Trump. He was able to read Trump. He had a very good understanding of how to flatter him. He knew how to play Trump like a violin.
Afterwards, when they faced the press, a shocking statement.
President Putin denied having anything to do with the election interference in 2016. Every U.S. intelligence agency has concluded that Russia did. My first question for you, sir, is who do you believe?
Who do you believe?
Jacob,
that's the starkest possible
I'm going to open up the maintenance elevator. That'll get you up here, yeah?
My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be.
I felt frozen to my chair. Like everybody else in the room, we couldn't believe it.
I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today. And what he did...
Everybody who was in the room with them just saw how masterfully Putin manipulated Trump.
People working on the case
He saw him as gullible and stupid and easily manipulatable. And that he was just, the Russian expression that he was just making ropes out of him, just braiding him like a braid.
Extraordinary moment in American history. Something I thought I would never see.
Disgraceful play by the United States stood by Vladimir Putin.
Back in Washington,
Concern continues to grow about what they said to each other behind closed doors.
we're calling it a bromance.
There's been some
Trying.
sort of
Well, the motor's shorted out when I transferred power.
Trump acted in some ways as an arm of Putin's foreign
The
policy.
system's not responding. You've got to do it manually.
Back asking, what good is NATO?
Questioning the entire point to one of America's oldest alliances.
And Trump was echoing Putin's talking points on the key battleground of Ukraine.
The president told leaders that, quote, Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
He would say Ukraine is a really corrupt country.
The president is saying that Crimea probably should belong to Russia because everyone is...
Are you still with me?
Crimea is Russian. Everybody there speaks Russian and wants to speak
I need to figure out why this system's acting up. We set the power down there to get to the other elevator.
Even
We're nearly
a
here.
real country.
Where did he hear these things? He heard them from Putin, and he would just echo them.
Trump is actually helping Putin reconstitute the Soviet Union.
It was just too easy.
Trump suggested it's pointless to continue punishing Russia.
He's getting pretty much everything he needs from President Trump. He's getting smackdown of NATO, the humiliation of our best allies, on and on and on. And so Putin was probably betting on a second term of President Trump and hoping that he could get his way on many things, whether it's NATO, whether it's Ukraine, without using the instrument of war.
But Trump did not get a second term.
The Fox News decision desk can now project that former Vice President Joe Biden
And with a new president,
Elect Joseph Robinette Biden.
Frankly, we did win this election.
an escalation of the chaos in America that Putin helped foment.
The president showing no signs that he's prepared to concede this election. Instead,
Division.
This is a contested election. Many people are nervous about
Violence. Insurrection.
Nobody loved January 6th more than the Russians did. Trump gave them 4 years, which was one big gift. But January 6th was like the wrapping, the beautiful wrapping, the package. January 6th, apart from anything else, leads directly to the war in Ukraine. Because it looks like America is not just morally discredited, it looks like America is weak.
Historic meeting with Russian President
Soon in Geneva, Vladimir Putin faced his worst of the United States.
For neither of them is this their first rodeo. Tensions seem to be a bit high.
Putin is looking at Biden and saying, this is a weak American president. He doesn't have the overwhelming support of his public. His people are so divided. Just months earlier, they'd had an attack on the Capitol. And all he needs to do is hold Biden off long enough so that he can continue to assemble the plan that he's putting together.
They're children of the Cold War, and they see each other and their countries through the Cold War. Biden saw Putin for what he is, a KGB revanchist who wants to remake the Russian Empire.
I just remember the body language of them sitting in that room together, and it's icy. I mean, these are two people who do not like each other.
Antony Blinken, now Secretary of State, was once again in the room.
The tone of the conversation was professional, it was direct, but it was very clear where we had our differences. President Biden made very clear where we saw things differently, and so did President Putin.
Try to determine where we have mutual interests.
A top priority for Biden, deterring Putin in Ukraine.
President Biden made clear in the meeting to President Putin our commitment to Ukraine, our commitment to its sovereignty, to its independence, to its territorial integrity.
They wanted to park Putin, but he didn't want to be parked. He wanted to be the number one problem of everybody in the whole world. but especially the number one priority, the number one threat, the number one problem that the White House was dealing with.
Putin began laying the groundwork for the invasion of Ukraine.
And 100,000 Russian troops near Ukraine's border are fueling fears of a
Russian forces start moving back toward Ukraine's border.
Heavy military equipment clearly taking an aggressive posture this weekend.
Not just the eastern border, but all three borders.
Russian troops have been surrounding Ukraine for days now.
Ukraine border with Belarus. Ukraine border with Russia. Ukraine border with occupied Crimea.
Satellite images show an increase in Russian forces on the Ukraine border.
At the White House,
Tensions nearing a tipping point.
an emergency presidential briefing. Secret information about Putin's plans.
And it was in that moment when the combination of seeing the forces deployed and then having, from the information we'd gotten, real visibility on what Russia was actually thinking and what they were planning. That's when we really saw the storm rising and heading in Ukraine's direction.
Once again, an American president was facing a critical decision about how to deal with Putin.
If Russia is allowed to get away with this, if Russia stomps all over Ukraine and takes it over, it affects the entire international order that we've been living under since World War II. The stakes were pretty high, and they continue to be very high.
In a video conference with Putin, Biden warned him to pull back from the brink.
He's saying, first of all, we see what you're doing, what you're planning, what you're plotting. And if you go ahead with what we're seeing, you need to understand the costs and consequences to Russia will be severe. And you need to know that I mean what I say.
Putin's response was familiar. Denial.
They're denying any imminent aggression against Ukraine, saying that that's not what we're doing. But because we had such extraordinary visibility and extraordinary information, we knew in real time when Putin was saying something that was in contradiction with what was actually happening.
Putin ignored Biden and pushed forward with the invasion.
Vladimir Putin understands the Western ability to make decisive steps pretty well. He knew that when President Biden said, don't do this, or, there will be consequences, he knew that there were not going to be any consequences.
For 2 decades, Vladimir Putin had defied American presidents. Invading Georgia, seizing Crimea, interfering in a presidential election. And he wasn't stopping now.
He made a calculation that Biden would not be able to lead an international group of countries to support Ukraine, and that there wouldn't be the will to support Ukraine, and even if it was there in the beginning, it would not continue.
30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin was now pursuing an all-out war to rebuild the Russian Empire.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Apocalyptic scenes on the outskirts of the capital.
A non-stop onslaught over the last 24 hours with mass casualties.
Tens of thousands of civilians trapped in cities under near constant Russian shell fire.
Putin wants Ukraine. He wants this pan-Slavic super-state with Moscow as the capital. He doesn't want his own country. I don't know how you compromise with somebody who just wants Ukraine. That's not something you could build a bridge across.
Ukraine is calling this a full-scale invasion.
Biggest
Ukraine.
Mobilizing more troops.
He would call up 300,000 men for military service.
Waging economic warfare.
No gas, no oil, nothing, he said, over a long winter.
Raising the specter of nuclear annihilation.
Now threatening to use nuclear weapons, and Putin says, I'm not bluffing.
It's all very concerning because what we saw was Vladimir Putin doubling and tripling down on the aggression with the mobilization, with the purported annexation of Ukrainian territory, with the loose talk about nuclear weapons. It's evidence that, unfortunately, tragically, this is likely to continue for some time.
Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent, hell-bent on rebuilding the Russian Empire. Now, a dangerous pariah on the world stage. Staring down yet another American president to see how far he will go.
Putin is escalating into a war with the West more broadly, cutting off energy, threatening nuclear weapons. And part of the reason is to undercut Western resolve and to make the West eager to get this over with.
And a big energy crisis this winter as Vladimir Putin cuts off the continent's natural gas supply.
He's hoping that he can put pressure on the West to back off.
Putin is counting on the fact that the Western powers are just going to lose interest in Ukraine.
How much longer the United States can continue to help bankroll this war? Will Ukraine ultimately be left to fight this war on its own?
pbs.org/frontline. Frontline, Putin and the President is available on Amazon Prime Video.
For an NBC News special report as we bring you the fifth public hearing of the January 6th committee from Washington, D.C. We know 3 former senior DOJ officials, including the former acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen, are all scheduled to testify today. All 3 of them met with the former president, Donald Trump, in the Oval Office on January 3rd. NBC Nightly News anchor Lester Holt picks up our coverage right now.
This is an NBC News special report. The results of a year-long investigation into the January 6th attack. Day 5 of the unprecedented congressional hearings. Today, testimony from Justice Department officials whom President Trump tried to force out over his false election fraud claims. As the committee tries to prove that the former president was responsible for the assault on the Capitol.
President Trump summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack.
New evidence set to be revealed today as the January 6th committee makes its case to the American people. Here now is Lester Holt.
Good day, everyone. Did former President Trump pressure the nation's top law enforcement agency to help overturn the 2020 election? That's the focus of today's hearing of the January 6th committee. Under the microscope, the Department of Justice and whether Donald Trump, along with a high-ranking DOJ member, plotted to get some states to decertify votes. We'll hear testimony about that and a potential scheme to shake up staffing within the department in order to advance Trump's fraudulent claims about winning the election. And just when we thought the committee would be wrapping up these hearings in a matter of days, a stunning development with so much new information being uncovered, the committee chairman says he's pressing pause, delaying the next 2 hearings until sometime next month. Why? It's to sift through what one panel member calls a mountain of new information centered on how the former president directed protesters toward the Capitol on January 6th and failed to control the violent mob. We'll be discussing that new evidence, which includes never-before-seen film footage of interviews with the First Family and Vice President Pence. We'll tell you where it came from and what it could mean for building a case against the former president. We'll get to all that, but first we focus on what lies ahead today, and that's a lot. We begin with NBC News senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Haig. Garrett, Tuesday's testimony focused on how election officials were harassed and even threatened in some states. Tell us more about what to expect as the focus now shifts to the Department of Justice.
Lester, today's hearing will have 2 main thrusts along that point. The first will be the effort by the Trump administration, the committee will claim, to pressure top DOJ leaders to come up with an investigation, or at least look like they were conducting an investigation into the claims of voter fraud that Trump had been making around the country. This hearing will be quarterbacked, if you will, by Republican Adam Kinzinger, and I had a chance to discuss with him yesterday how he sees this portion of their case shaping up. Here's what he told me. So is it fair to say that the president was trying to use the DOJ's credibility against the election result?
I think that's very fair to say. I think it's fair to say that the president really wanted the stamp of doubt that comes with a DOJ seal.
So if part 1 of this hearing then is the focus on getting the DOJ to open up investigation or investigations into these claims of voter fraud, part 2 is what happens after our witnesses today, 3 top former DOJ officials, refuse to do so. And that is, the committee will outline an effort to replace the head of the DOJ with a more compliant figure, a man named Jeff Clark, who was an environmental lawyer and who the committee believes there was a full-fledged scheme to have take control of the DOJ. Instead, there was something of a revolt among top DOJ officials and staffers saying they would not serve under Clark, and so that portion of the president's plan was never put into action. But that is what the committee intends to lay out today in broad strokes, Lester.
All right, Garrett, thank you. Joining me here now, my colleagues Hallie Jackson, our senior Washington correspondent, and Chuck Todd, NBC's political director and moderator of Meet the Press. Thanks for both being here. Chuck, start us off. What are you looking for today? What's important to key in on?
Well, look, this is meddling at the Justice Department, and if we talk about all the parallels to Watergate, this is probably the most direct parallel to Watergate in the infamous Saturday Night Massacre, where then President Nixon essentially wanted the people investigating him fired, and he needed the Attorney General to be compliant. So obviously it was a different thing he was looking for, but this was a case where it looks like this is what Donald Trump's going to do. And there had been there's no laws here that say a president can, they work for the president. He could have done this. He was within his constitutional rights, but there's been this accepted practice post-Watergate that you don't meddle. Bill Clinton wanted to fire his special prosecutor a bunch of times, but he didn't. Politically, you wouldn't touch Janet Reno at that time, and it didn't happen. So today, I think this is how he tried to essentially use the government and the credibility of the Justice Department to give more credibility to these claims. I mean, you'll hear in some of these snippets, we've seen the reporting, he simply wanted the announcement. Give me the press release, I'll spin it. I think
we'll do the rest.
We'll do the rest is what it was. So this...
I think the most shocking part of this scheme is that Donald Trump decided not to do it. And that's the part of this that I think has always been, and this is, for what it's worth, I think is it makes it a little bit tougher to charge him with something over time. I think Mr. Clark's in a lot more potential legal trouble than on this case than Mr. Trump, because he didn't pull the trigger. But it does seem as if he was close. And the more I've learned about this, the more I'm still personally surprised he didn't go through with it.
Well, Hallie, all these hearings have really been a story of a president who's walking at least right up to the line.
Yeah.
And it's unclear in some of these cases whether he crossed it in a major kind of a way. What are you looking for?
I'm looking for that, Lester. These are people who were in conversations with the president, and I imagine we'll hear about a couple of them end of December, again in early January, in the room with him, with, in some cases, his top White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, other people who were key to the president's inner circle at the time. At any point, did Donald Trump acknowledge to them that what he was doing, he knew would violate the law in the way that they were describing, right? So I think that's one of the key pieces we have to watch for here. I think when you look broadly at this, a lot of the conversations that we're going to hear have been reported, frankly, by our outlet, by the New York Times, the Washington Post, others, right? But what I think is going to be critical here is listening to the storyline as it weaves together. Think about the, for lack of a better word, the characters that we're going to meet today. In some ways, this is a tale of two Jeffs, Jeffrey Clark and Jeffrey Rosen, right? Jeffrey Clark, this environmental lawyer, that was his background, who was introduced to the president, connected to the president, reportedly through a Republican member of Congress, who I think we'll hear more about and who we'll talk more about, who backed the president's lies of election fraud, essentially, was sympathetic to that, to the point where Jeffrey Clark even wrote a letter, 5-page letter, describing ways that he thought that Donald Trump could, in the state of Georgia, for example, push back against the legitimate election results. Jeffrey Rosen and the other witnesses we're going to hear from, Richard Donahue and Stephen Engel, they were pushing hard against the president the other way, right? Involved in these meetings, saying, if you do this, if you put Jeffrey Clark in charge, we're out. We're done, we quit, right? And these people are interesting. We've talked a lot about Jeff Rosen, right? The one-time acting attorney general, who was only in that job for about a month after Bill Barr resigned.
That is a mystery, and we're not solving, but Bill Barr's never give us the full explanation of why he decided to quit early. I think we all have an idea. He didn't want to have to tell the president no.
And the relationship was deteriorated pretty badly.
Well, he did, but he also decided to walk away.
The votes weren't there, yeah.
Right. He also decided to walk away.
End of December, right.
Because he knew what he might be asked to do next, and he perhaps didn't want to be put in that position. It is still the fact that Barr left Jeffrey Rosen in this position has always been something that I think needs a little more exploration than we've been able to get.
So you have Rosen. He's going to be one of the live witnesses. You have a guy named Richard Donahue, who, by the way, we know took notes about some of these meetings, handwritten notes.
By the way, most lawyers, you ever met a lawyer that doesn't take notes?
I was going to say, typical British, fascinating notes, right? Because he's describing the things that Donald Trump was saying in these conversations. I'd be shocked if that doesn't come up in the hearing today. I think we can show you some of the notes he took where he describes pieces of the conversation where the former president, Chuck, to your point, said exactly that. All I need is for you to, and I'm paraphrasing here, is to make the announcement. Republican congressman, he says, just say that the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman, is what Donahue says the president says.
And then, he just wanted irregularities. Well, whatever. Anything out of the Justice Department's mouth.
I'm also interested in Stephen Engel, who is the former Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel at the DOJ. Not a household name. I think that's fair to say, right? Not somebody who was at the center of a lot of the discussion in the lead up to January 6th and in the months after. This is somebody who, though, was on, for example, the Supreme Court long list from President Trump at the time when he was in office back in September of 2020, in case there had been an opening, et cetera. He is somebody who was a well-respected attorney who was also in these meetings. And that is interesting because there hasn't been a lot of public reporting about what he has had to say or what he saw and heard. So I think there's a lot of threads to pull on, but that's at least where I'm starting, Lester.
All right, let me go to our Washington correspondent, Yamiche Alcindor. She's with us. Today's hearing might be the most impactful so far. Why do you think that?
Well, they might be the most impactful so far because you're going to hear directly from Department of Justice officials about their direct conversations with former President Trump. There's been a lot said of sort of what people might have heard or what people thought, but the fact that these are going to be the people who were in the room with the president. We heard, of course, from people who had been on calls with the president, but these are going to be people who know firsthand just how far former President Trump was willing to go. And I think a lot of the issues that are at hand you've talked about at the table, but there's also this key word of pardons. Representative Scott Perry and a number of Republican lawmakers were accused, and lawmakers say, of trying to seek pardons after January 6th and even in some cases in the days before January 6th because they were worried about the activities that they had taken part in. So I think it's going to be very interesting to learn sort of was there a pardon list? Did former President Trump talk about that? What role possibly could the Department of Justice have had in that? I also think, of course, Jeffrey Clark is going to be fascinating to hear about because we heard, of course, about his involvement in the 5-page letter that he wrote, a draft letter about what the DOJ could do and how it could possibly tell states not to continue counting votes or to possibly overturn the 2020 election. But also, Jeffrey Clark was someone who had this sort of really dramatic meeting in the Oval Office where his bosses, one of them not even being able to wear a suit, he was out walking as apparently Richard Donahue, and had to run to the White House to try to convince former President Trump not to put Jeffrey Clark in charge. One other thing, the politics of this are going to be something that I'm going to be watching, because we know now that the Biden administration is under a lot of pressure to really be more aggressive, rather, with Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, in trying to push him to prosecute more people in connection with the January 6th investigation. And there are some Democrats who have told me, frankly, they want the DOJ to be doing more. But the White House has said over and over again that they're not going to be pressured into doing what they think their predecessors did, which was treating the DOJ as their personal legal arm. Instead, President Biden has said, I'm going to allow the DOJ to be very, very independent of me. I think that's the politics of this is going to be really interesting to see because of the juxtaposition of these two administrations.
All right, Yamiche, thank you. I want to bring in our NBC News legal analyst and criminal defense attorney, Danny Savalas. Danny, we have heard a lot about Bill Barr. He's had a lot of airtime, if you will, in these hearings. We're going to talk about him probably again today. He has been kind of positioned as the guy that stood up early and said, Mr. President, these votes aren't here, these fraudulent votes aren't here. What should we know as we continue to watch him use in these hearings?
For the last week, Bill Barr has gotten a kind of a pass, and it's probably because he may have the most memorable line to date in these proceedings. And I won't repeat it here, Lester, don't worry.
With a B, yeah.
But it starts with a B, and it went around the world, and people saw that as Bill Barr standing up to Trump. And that is held for about a week. I think that's going to change today, and I'll tell you why. Because we are probably going to hear about things like a memorandum that Bill Barr issued that we reported on back when it came out, that essentially said, look, if there's some real obvious indications of election fraud, then you, DOJ, can investigate it, which many people in the DOJ, in the public integrity, they pushed back. People did not agree with this memorandum. Now, I think Bill Barr positions it in the very language of the memo as if he's slow walking it, as if he's doing the bare minimum. Well, look, I probably shouldn't look into this, but I'll just issue a memo that says, hey, if you see something glaring, look into it, but otherwise, don't do much. In the Georgia situation with the suitcases of votes, conduct some interviews, talk to some people, and then do that, and then be done with it. So Bill Barr may position this as, hey, I just did the bare minimum. I wasn't really carrying out Trump's orders. But I think today we're going to hear a slightly different story, and it will be really the ones who stood up are going to be folks like Rosen and Donahue, who apparently, according to the evidence, stood up the entire time, never gave an inch. And when it came to things like sending out letters about canceling out electors, they said, heck no, we're not doing that. No chance.
And to Chuck's point, the president didn't go through.
He didn't go through it.
So
his allies will say often, right? Yeah. I mean, that is something you hear from those close.
So where does intent, if you're looking at this through a purely legal lens, where does intent play?
In the law, we have a thing called inchoate or incomplete crimes. That's crimes like attempt or conspiracy, where the actual eventual crime may not even be carried out. But as a matter of public policy, we punish the itself. You don't want to reward people for being really lousy at committing crimes or maybe changing their mind at the very end. So to me, what I'm going to be looking for is the requisite intent, not whether or not this was actually completed. The mere fact that Trump asks and is told it's wrong and then apparently asks again and again based on really nothing that we've seen other than, and I'm quoting some prior witnesses, theories and not evidence. I think that's going to be critical here. And there comes a point where intent is assumed if somebody continues on in the face of knowledge or information that what they are doing is wrong. And I think that's what the committee's trying to build here.
I guess the question I have is what did he do illegally in this situation? Because he had the authority to hire and fire everybody that was in that Oval Office with him.
That's right. So that's the problem with this, is that it doesn't fit neatly into definitions of crimes. And it's really easy for someone like me to stand up here and look at the crimes code and say, oh, this could be conspiracy to defraud the United States, right? Or this could even just be mail fraud because something went in the mail. But it's an entirely different thing where you have a totally unprecedented set of facts and a totally unprecedented situation. I think this is quite different. It reminds us of the Saturday Night Massacre, but it is factually a lot different. I would argue that the efforts are even more documented and more severe than they were in the case of the Saturday Night Massacre. And of course, as you pointed out, you don't have DOJ officials actually leaving. They're just threatening to leave. And you have this Jeffrey Clark figure who's going to be like an Iago figure today, scheming behind the scenes to get the job and going at some point to Jeffrey Rosen and saying, look, it's a real nice job you have at the DOJ. If you want to keep it, if you send out these letters, then maybe I don't want the job so much.
Janie, do you think we'll have a better idea of why Barr left early?
No, and I think that's something everybody wants to know. Why, and why at that moment? Why so close to the end, and why just essentially moments before all these other things happen?
With our family.
Sure, we all want to spend more time with our family. That's a fine enough reason. But why not finish it out? Why leave when he did? Will we ever get an answer to that? I don't think we will today.
What was happening.
He knew the entire time.
He knew what was going to be. He had already dealt with some of it. I find this to be there's a lot of little unsolved side mysteries. This is one that it feels like I didn't feel like we got a great explanation even in this book.
Well, and I just remember I was covering the White House at the time, and I was talking to people who were close to Bill Barr at the time when the speculation was, is he going to leave? Is he going to leave? And these folks would tell me things like, well, he feels like he can do his job right now. His relationship is obviously deteriorating with Donald Trump at the time. But Chuck, this is a guy, Lester, you interviewed him. He wrote a book about the experience. He's talked extensively in multiple interviews about that experience, and that is still one of those outstanding questions.
Yeah, let me go to NBC News national security correspondent Ken Delaney, and he's live at the Justice Department. Ken, we're going to hear a lot more about Jeffrey Clark today. We probably won't hear anything, though, about the visit that he received from federal agents.
That's right, Lester. You've been talking about how Jeffrey Clark and his activities will be, in many ways, the centerpiece of this hearing we're about to watch. Well, we learned a few hours ago that Jeffrey Clark's home was visited yesterday by a number of federal law enforcement agents. The government is being rather circumspect about what exactly happened. An official just said there was some law enforcement activity at Jeffrey Clark's Virginia home. But Jeffrey Clark's boss, who is a former Trump administration official, has said in a statement that this was essentially a pre-dawn raid by a dozen federal agents who took Jeffrey Clark out of his home in his pajamas and seized his electronic devices. Now, if that characterization is correct, Lester, it suggests these agents had obtained a search warrant, which means they convinced the judge that there was probable cause to believe that a crime was occurring. Now, often a search warrant in such cases would be served if they believe a subject is concealing evidence or destroying evidence that otherwise could have been obtained by a subpoena. And this is a huge development in this investigation, this parallel investigation that is being run by the Justice Department out of that building behind me into what happened here in terms of efforts to overturn the election. Doubly significant because, as we're going to hear today, almost everything that Jeffrey Clark was doing and talking about in terms of scheming to overturn this election, he was discussing with the then President of the United States, Donald Trump. And had he succeeded in some of these schemes, it could have been a much different result. One of the things he was trying to do was get the Justice Department to send letters to various states saying that the Justice Department had found fraud in the election, when in fact the Justice Department had found no such thing. But had those letters gone out, it could have emboldened people who wanted to install false electors and really change the game. So this was a very close call. We're going to hear today that these Trump-appointed Justice Department officials did the right thing when it mattered and said no to this stuff and threatened to resign. But the theory of the case was outlined by Liz Cheney when she gave her dramatic opening statement at the beginning of all these hearings, which is that there was a conspiracy here that she argues is criminal. She used the word corrupt many times to overthrow the election, that whether they succeeded or not does not matter, that the conspiracy still existed and should be investigated.
Ken, are the DOJ and the committee playing well together here?
Well, there were some reports in recent days that the DOJ was asking for transcripts that the committee of committee witness testimony that the committee did not want to hand over. But my understanding is that they are playing well together. There are a lot of federal prosecutors working for this, former federal prosecutors working for this January 6th committee, people who have worked in this building behind me, who know how this works. They want to conduct a thorough investigation, but they don't appear to intend in any way to be hiding anything or keeping anything from the Justice Department. There are logistical issues, but those can be worked out.
Ken, thanks very much. And Chuck, there seems to be one of the subplots is the pressure on DOJ. As this stuff unfolds and people's jaws are dropping, they look to DOJ. Well, what are you going to do about it?
Look, it has been notable that since the start of these hearings, the Department of Justice has let us know
about a bunch of new things they've been doing with their investigation. Is this a way for Garland to sort of answer some of the criticism he's been getting, whispers from the Hill, whispers from the White House? Because all of a sudden you see subpoenas being issued. You see a phone being seized from a Nevada Republican Party chair, the Georgia Republican Party chair. And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, Department of Justice feels like it's suddenly getting more aggressive. Look, it is, I think the reason why the committee's been so frustrated, and I've been talking with some of the committee members, is that they feel as if, they've been pedal to the metal in their investigation. They feel as if justice opened the investigation. They have focused on the act of January 6th and have been
Oh, man, it's grateful.